Yes, there he is, Mr. White South Afrikaner himself.
Oh,
Tim
yes, yeah, that's me.
Your old. Apparently, David Duke, your old friend, speaking of old friends, was always a big fan of the South Afrikaners. I mean, I got to start there with you. Good to see you. Thank you very much for joining me. We're importing more racist white people.
Yes, well, we don't. Apparently, we must have forgotten how to make them. I guess is what Donald Trump thinks.
I don't think.
I don't think we did. In my experience, we have not stopped creating our own. That's one of those things we don't need to import. And I'm going to tell you, if we're going to keep importing Afrikaners, we need like 1,000,000% tariff. So let's at least raise some money and pay down a trade deficit with those guys. But yeah, it's such an indication of what this administration is selling around the world, and really more even importantly, selling internally to its base, which is a message that America is a white country by white people for white people, and not only white people from here, but white people from anywhere. Literally, essentially what Donald Trump has said is that white people from South Africa with no historical connection to this country should be made more welcome here than black folks who've been here for 15, 16 generations. More welcome here than Latino folk, many of whose families, if they live in the American Southwest, actually do trace their history back to that land, which is to say that when they come back over that border, they are in a sense coming home ancestrally. I realize borders are a thing. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying in a sense, he's saying that those people with more of a connection to this country and to this land should feel less at home than some, white supremacist Dutch, in effect, immigrant to South Africa now wanting to come here because they can't get over the fact that apartheid fell 30 years ago.
Tim, in some ways, what we're saying now is reverse apartheid.
Well, and that's right. And you've been working on that. I can tell on that impression. That's very good. Yeah, I mean, that is essentially right. Everything that this administration says and does is premised on the notion of white victimhood and grievance. So whether it's ending DEI programs, whether it's firing highly qualified civil servants who got their position through a civil service process, which is a purely meritocratic process with scores and grades and categories, getting rid of them because he assumes that they're all incompetent. They are, of course, disproportionately black women who've lost their jobs. When he does that, when he threatens schools who teach accurate history, when you go after the Blacksonian, as we call it, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, when you go after the Museum of African American History in Boston, where Frederick Douglass spoke and other abolitionists organized, because you say, as the president did in a letter to that museum, funding this is no longer in the interest of the United States, nor does it further the agenda of the president of the United States.
Oh, I didn't hear.
Yeah, what you're saying when you do that is that this country doesn't really belong to all of the people who've been here. It really belongs to white people. And that's why, go back to first, there's not only South Africa. What did Trump say first term? He wanted fewer immigrants from so-called shithole countries. And remember the ones he said he wanted more of? Norway, Denmark, right? Of course, ignoring that nobody in Denmark or Norway would want to come to the United States and give up their far superior healthcare and social safety nets. But that was his argument. He doesn't mind immigration. MAGA doesn't mind immigration. What they mind is immigration by people they consider inferior, and the South African thing just really proves it.
Massachusetts Museum of African American History learned a 3-year federal grant was terminated. Its leader worries their work is at risk after President Donald Trump issued an executive order targeting the Smithsonian last month. Wow, I did not hear about that. But of course, so just one more question specifically, it's worth mentioning how refugee resettlement works. It's really hard to get in to the country and to America and most countries as a refugee. You have to be very properly vetted. Sometimes you've been vetted and approved and still waiting for years before you can get in. And that's the case. That's one program. There's so many programs. It's very hard for people to understand, including me. But then you've got people who are here, in this case, under something called temporary protection status, TPAS. That was Afghans and Cameroonians. Specifically, these Afghans, many of them and their families, had assisted American members of the military in Afghanistan. He's sending them out not bringing those that have been vetted and in line in. Meanwhile, bringing in white South Africans, we vetted them ourselves last week when we went through their social media. They're none too kind to the Jews.
Yeah. Yeah. Now these are people, and there's a large movement in South Africa of which these individuals are part, to varying degrees, which has propagated this lie about white genocide for many years. It started out in the fever swamps of the South African far right, but very quickly, obviously spread via social media to the American white nationalist movement and far right. The only place that you would see this material was coming out of overtly white supremacist space, not because they're the biggest truth tellers, but because they had a propaganda value in feeding this lie. And it is a lie. Are there individuals and even political movements in South Africa within the Black community that have very deep-seated prejudices towards white people in South Africa? Yes, absolutely. And the videotape that keeps going around shows a third party, not the African National Congress, not the president's party, not a governing party, having a rally where they're talking about kill the Boer, kill the Boer. And I'm not going to defend the chant, but what I am going to tell you is if you don't want them to come to power, you might want to support the government that's there right now trying to do things for all South Africans, according to the very, white individuals that the president brought with him, Ernie Els and the Secretary of Agriculture, whatever it is, both of whom are telling him this is not real. This is not what's happening. If you don't want that kind of rhetoric to be more common, you might want to support the party and the movement that comes out of the Mandela movement and out of the ANC, which is what is currently in power. But if you weaken them, if you impose these sanctions in this particular time on them over a bunch of lies about what is and is not happening, right, then what's going to happen is you're going to weaken that government. You're going to weaken that leadership. And it's going to potentially be replaced by the very people that you're claiming apparently you're already in charge. Well, they're not now, and I understand that there's, as we've heard last day and a half on this, there's plenty of violence that takes place in any country, I beg to remind your listeners, that is emerging from autocracy and dictatorship and tyranny to democracy. That happened in this country. We had a civil war that claimed 700,000 lives because we couldn't get it straight. So when a country is trying to become a democracy, it's not fast, it's not quick, and it's not pretty. It's oftentimes very ugly. But the fact that there's crime and the fact that there's desperation in people who only own, in spite of being 75% of the population, own a minuscule percentage of the land relative to their size of the population, shouldn't surprise anyone. The question is, what do we do about that? We don't make up lies. We don't exaggerate this idea that white farmers are just being slaughtered in their sleep because they're white. That's simply not accurate. And he has been corrected over and over and over again. But the propaganda value of saying it in this country right now is incredibly high. And if you just look at what white nationalists on Twitter and elsewhere are saying, they are absolutely over the moon about how President Trump treated President Ramaphosa. And I mean, we're talking, effusive praise about how he owned him, about how he, which is very interesting terminology given the dynamic.
I didn't even think of that. We say it to everybody, but it certainly doesn't sound good when you're talking about a white person and a black person.
Right. It's just this over the moon effusive praise about how brilliant it was.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was based on lies, and the fact that Donald Trump had multiple people telling him it was not true who live in South Africa, at least a couple of whom were white, and he just, reverts back to whatever.
It really wasn't brilliant. It was really like everything else that he does, very cringe and very mediocre and very amateurish and very unorganized, and he sounded really dumb, Donald Trump. On the other hand, the black guy has been around for a long time. I guess he was a protege of Mandela's. He's a diplomat in training in his background in many ways. So he's very comfortable in such situations. But who could be comfortable in Donald Trump's Oval Office, where he just savaged a world leader who had most of the world's sympathy, Zelensky? So this guy comes in, South African president, and he's smart enough to bring 3 rich white golfers.
Yeah.
Which is very smart. He makes a clever improv joke about, I wish I had a plane to give you. Trump doesn't even realize it's a joke.
No, in fact, Trump plays into it and says, I wish you did too. I would have taken it.
They all look terrible. And I think he looked as good as you could. I mean, you could criticize the guy for showing up, I suppose. Who's the next world leader that's going to take that bait? You have to. I think just part of the cost of entry, I guess, is to be part of his reality show in the Oval Office with Elon and all the rest of these jamokes looking on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, just another word about white genocide and the background of that and what it means to people, because I just remember years ago when I first started hosting the old show on Sirius XM, some troll had that as his like handle on Twitter. He'd always come after me. I never blocked him. I was entertained. But I remember thinking, man, those two words together, that is ringy, that is catchy, that's a real good propaganda combo. But I'm glad it's so fringe. The president of the United States now using it, Tim. Come a long way.
Right. No, I mean, that terminology starts to show up in the, I guess, what do we call them? The aughts, the late aughts, 2008, 9, 10. And you see it on the far right within the American neo-Nazi and white nationalist movement. There is this whole movement that was, I'm not going to get into the names and the faces of these individuals, but they had this mantra that they would go post, and they would post it everywhere. They'd post it on Amazon reviews about books that weren't even about race at all, just like reviews of pots and pans and containers to put food in. They would just go and post this on YouTube channels for no reason. And it was like this long mantra that essentially was a combination of a white genocide concept and the need to, and then the whole 14 words, David Lane's 14 words from the Order, the white supremacist terrorist group from the 80s, the thing about protecting, preserving a nation for white children or whatever.
They would go and cut and paste this propaganda.
They had a long mantra. So it was longer than David Lane's 14 words precepts. It was several paragraphs long. And it essentially mocked the idea of everything from the Holocaust to white supremacy as a concept, and basically made the argument that diversity is just code for anti-white and therefore is a precursor to genocide. So they've been saying that for a while. But like you said, it was fringe. It was really fringe. Like the people that would say this stuff weren't even like the smarts within the white nationalist movement. Right. The really would never have been sort of this aggressive and this blatant. They would have known that it's like, that's maybe not the right way to go. But like you said, now you have literally people, including the president, who are using the terminology. You have the richest man on the planet using the terminology, right? Suggesting that this is real. And he has the ability to pump that lie to millions of followers long before fact checkers can catch up, right? And he has the ability to also turn down the volume on the algorithm for the fact checkers on his own platform, which is the main way that he's spreading the lie anyway. Right. So it's very difficult to compete with that. And then the lie becomes truth in the minds of people who haven't actually looked into this subject and have never cared at all about what's going on in Africa until they decided that there was some handful of farmers that were being dispossessed of their land, when really the only thing they've been dispossessed of is the right to control and dominate Black people at their whim, and the right to have an apartheid state, which is not a right that they ever had or should have had.
And to be clear, you're referring to Elon Musk owns Twitter. He tweaked the Twitter AI called Grok so that if you typed in white genocide, it would give you the feedback that Elon wanted you to have, not any kind of truth or
it was worse than that. You didn't even have to type in white genocide. You could ask Grok, like, what's the best recipe for meatloaf? And Grok, for that hour or so that this was happening, or however long it was, would just say, first you get your hamburger and your tomato sauce. And by the way, some say there's a white genocide happening in South Africa. I mean, it was that kind of thing. It was just being, it was in response to stuff that had nothing to do with the issue at all. And then the other day, it started doing that about the Holocaust, like questioning the whether or not 6 million Jews had actually died. And then when Grok was asked, why'd you do that? Grok, being, I guess, honest AI, said, responds by, they were not trained to lie the way humans actually lie, but spits back that, the coding was tampered with in an unauthorized way or something at 1:26 in the morning. Well, who's up at 1:26 in the morning every morning? We know who's up at 1:26 in the morning every morning. It's Elon. Well, Trump is too, but Trump doesn't know how to code. Elon doesn't actually, apparently from the history, doesn't really know how to code either very well, but he probably could at least tweak the AI on Grok and get it to spit out these sort of neo-Nazi fantasies. It's once again, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a Nazi, and that's what we have.
Yeah, for sure. All right. What about the arrest of the black congresswoman? Was that something that you wanted to opine about in Newark? I feel like that is a stress test. Everything is a specific test. Let's arrest this student who is pro-Palestinian and wrote an essay. Let's arrest this student who was an organizer. Let's arrest this black congresswoman. Let's see how people react to us arresting whoever we want, wherever we want, for whatever we decide.
Right. I think that's really what they're doing. I think they know that these cases, they're not going to hold up, or the charges will probably even be dropped. To be honest, there's an incredibly good chance that just as the charges were ultimately dropped against Ras Baraka, that they would also be against the congresswoman. And I think that any real attempt to get an indictment, I mean, as they say, you can indict a ham sandwich, but not necessarily true. And even if you do, I don't think any jury is going to convict this congresswoman of anything that was illegal. I think they know that that many of the detentions, if we can actually get them before a judge, these kidnappings essentially off the street that ICE has been doing, that they'll lose those cases too. But I agree, what they're doing is they're really checking to see, will people come out into the streets to protest this? Will people? And I think for the Trump people, frankly, they win either way in their mind, right? In their mind, they're hoping, okay, well, maybe people won't protest and then we can just keep doing it. Or the other thing is, well, maybe they will protest in really large numbers, and then we can use that as a pretext to suspend habeas corpus, which we've already floated as an idea, and then just start arresting people willy-nilly for nothing at all. And the reason that now starts to make sense is when you have Stephen Miller talking about the suspension of habeas corpus being this essentially unlimited right that the president has. Yeah, he was talking about it with regard to undocumented people coming over the border, presumably, combatants or something under the Alien Enemies Act. But once you suspend habeas corpus, it's not like you just suspend it for like one area. If you suspend it, it's pretty much either suspended or it's very easy to just move that line. Even if he didn't initially, I don't think he's going to say, well, that's just for the immigrants, but all of you people in the street that are yelling and saying bad things about me and my family, I'm just going to let that go. We know this man, right? He's going to want to suspend it with regard to that. He's going to take any pretext of like property destruction, like if one window gets smashed, right? If one car gets overturned, if one rock gets thrown at a cop, well, that's going to happen. That happens in every demonstration, regardless of whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. It's going to happen. And then you're going to use that as a pretext to just start rounding people up and suspending their constitutional rights. So I think they are trying to see just how much will the Democrats push back on this stuff and how much will the public push back on this stuff. And it remains to be seen. I think they're going to lose these cases in court. That's the good news. But the bad news is everything they do is it's pushing the envelope, seeing what they can get away with, because they have a lot more serious designs on democracy than just this.
Yeah. And I thought also, even if they lose these things in court, the other bad news is courts don't have law enforcement agents to enforce their orders. In the end, it's up to Pam Bondi, and we know she's problematic, to say the least. I want to ask you about the conversation about DEI policy in our country right now. It's really important and fascinating and very hard to track. It's hard to track what the federal government has said and done, what courts have said and done. It's hard to track what states' policies are enact and not. I think it's really important looking at it in schools across the country, for sure. And I've been in the fight, the local school board. Just learned that Jersey Public School apparently has rescinded its DEI policies or initiatives. I didn't read too far into it. I was like, oh, why would they do that? Then the other thing I thought was interesting is that it seems that the boycott of Target as a result of their rescinding DEI was effective. And I was someone who criticized. I was like, boycotts haven't worked in this country. There's no solidarity. We're not boycotting convenient stores with their low prices. So my question to you is the state of the union of DEI, local schools and corporations and businesses. How are you looking at it and thinking about it? This is something that obviously you directly know probably as much about as anybody.
I mean, the state of things is not good, obviously. I was in Kansas the other day for the 71st anniversary of Brown v. Board, and was there invited by the committee that celebrates that's actually chaired by Cheryl Brown Henderson, who's one of the children of the main plaintiff, Oliver Brown, in that case. And while I was there, I was joking. The only reason that I was able to come to Kansas to even give a speech on these issues was because it was this nonprofit organization. I wouldn't have been brought in to speak to any state agency. I wouldn't have even probably been brought in to speak at Washburn University, where we actually held the event, were it not for this particular historical commemoration, because there are at least 30 states that are not having speakers, programming, trainings, any of these kind of conversations because of the fear, ill-founded, but the fear that they are going to be slapped down legally for doing so because of executive orders that the president passed. Keeping in mind, as I've said before, and many have said it, I'm not the first one to say it, but executive orders, contrary to popular belief, are not law. Right. They do not carry the force of law. They are essentially press releases on better stationery. That is what executive orders actually are. And yes, they can have effect, but for the most part, the things that he's tried to do with regard to DEI and schools, including, plans to shutter the Department of Education, the courts have now just stepped in to stop those moves, or I think as of today, that's what I read. So you've got these orders, which the courts are saying this is not legal. There was no due process to this practice at all. It's also an infringement on First Amendment rights. There's a lot of different things that are in the hopper that the lawyers are fighting out in court. And what I think all of it suggests is that the pullback within the private sector, the pullback within nonprofits and even philanthropies that fund nonprofits, we're seeing some of that now. Talk of philanthropies not wanting to give money to racial justice efforts because of the fear that they're going to be in some way sanctioned, right? That is anticipatory compliance at its worst. There is nothing about these executive orders or any law that Congress has passed. They haven't done any legislation on this to suggest that these programs are illegal. Not one court in the history of our country has said that DEI programs are illegal. And contrary to the way they're making the argument, the affirmative action case that involved Harvard and the University of North Carolina were not cases about DEI. Those were about one particular kind of admissions program in the undergraduate schools of those institutions. They are not the same as DEI programs either in the private sector or the state sector or the educational sector. So folks have got to be willing to stand up, because when they decide to comply in advance for fear of something that is irrational, that they are not going to, I'm telling you, they're not going to lose these cases in court. I was involved. I told you about this. I was involved in a case up in Seattle that, at least as of now, I'm sure it's being appealed, but I was an expert witness in a case brought by someone who was in contact apparently with Christopher Rufo, who's the mastermind of the attack on DEI, giving him information about this horrible program that the city of Seattle has to indoctrinate people in anti-white, propaganda, et cetera. And we went to court and the judge threw it out, granted summary judgment to the city. I was the expert for this city in the case, explaining why this was not discriminatory, why this was not, the kind of thing that should be considered a hostile environment for white people or whatever. And the judge agreed and said, this is just not a case. And that's actually not the only decision like that. There've been a couple of other decisions like that in the last year. So we know that even if institutions were to get sued, they're going to win these cases. But if you decide to comply in advance and you give up the fight, then this is what happens. And that's what's happening right now around the country. And that's what I fear when I think about corporate America pulling back. I do want to say there are institutions though out there. Target is clearly not one of them, but there are institutions that have decided to double down on DEI efforts and equity efforts. I actually got to speak at a company up in and I want to give them a plug, Schreiber Foods. A food processor manufacturer out of I was in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and they have strengthened their commitment to fairness and equity. They don't necessarily use the term, but I don't think they really use the terms even before, but they talk about that principle. That principle is very important to them, about the kind of team building that's made possible by inclusive practices. And so if you've got a company like that, Green Bay is a pretty white area of a pretty white state. It's not like they would have felt necessarily demographic pressure from the people in the community to adhere to that, but good for them. So I think there are a lot of good examples out there of companies in a lot of different sectors that have held the line. And if those who were doing the anticipatory compliance would, grow a backbone, pay attention to those examples, then maybe we could fight back on this more effectively.
SchreiberFoods.com. They got like 10,000 employees and like $7 billion in sales. It's not like they're a small company. If they can do it, then big company should be able to, for sure. What were your thoughts when you read or heard about the killing of this young Israeli couple about to be engaged there at the Israeli, I guess, embassy in DC last night? This 31-year-old kid from Chicago shot them dead, and he shouts, "Free Palestine. I did it for Palestine. I did it for Gaza." Talk about not needing to really dig deep into the motive of a shooter. The guy just starts screaming, "This is why I did it." Apparently at some point he was affiliated with, far left political movements and so on. And so what are your thoughts about this?
Well, first off, I mean, it's just a horrific, horrible, horrible crime. It's just there's no way to get your head around it. There's no way to rationalize it. There's no way to suggest there's anything about it that's okay. And luckily, I haven't seen too many people trying, so that's good, I suppose.
Yeah.
Restoring my faith in humanity a little bit. I also think that it's important to note that no Palestinian asked this fool to do this. No Palestinian, no Gazan said, what we need you to do is we need you to go shoot these two young people who are about to get married in front of, whatever this event is, this center is. Like no one asked for that. So when you say I did it for Palestine, I did it for Gaza, I did it for Palestinians, it's just, I mean, I know plenty of people who are suffering right now. I know people in Palestine. I know people who have lost folks, and I don't think any of them are feeling any safer because these two young people were killed by some moron who doesn't speak.
Oh, they should all feel, I would imagine they all feel like after 9/11, like more of a target. I mean, any thinking Palestinian person, if you've told them, I'm going to go kill this couple of Israel, they're like, please don't do that. That will be a very bad thing for our movement, as it always is in these cases, it would seem.
Absolutely right. So the idea and then what really concerns me about this, in addition to just, again, the horrific nature of the crime and the foolishness, in addition to the evil of the shooter, the foolishness of the shooter from a strategic perspective. And I hate to even talk about that because it's obviously just a horrible, heinous crime. But it also is, if you thought you were helping the movement, my God, it's like probably the worst thing that you could have possibly done. And the only other thing that makes that even worse is that I've been watching, what little bit of the news I can stomach nowadays. And I'm watching all of these militantly pro-Israel commentators, the ones that just won't critique even just the government of Netanyahu, let alone the larger project of political Zionism and Israel as a state and all of those things. Forget that. They don't even want to criticize the government as it exists. And they never, ever criticize anything Israel does. And they're on television and they're on MSNBC. I'm not even talking about like the usual suspects. I mean, they are on so-called progressive television talking about how this is just proof of how, that everyone on the campuses last year and everyone in the streets was just a Hamas supporter and they're all terrorists. And there's no difference between the students that were rising up and demanding justice and this guy who shot and killed these two people, because that's what that side of the argument wants to do, is to conflate legitimate concerns about the slaughter of Palestinian people and the mistreatment of Palestinians in Gaza and in Israel proper and in the West Bank, to conflate that with support for terrorism and murder. And the more that this kind of thing happens, sadly, the more, and that's in addition to not wanting anyone to die for at all, it's just strategically inept to believe that you're going to help the movement for Palestinian freedom and liberation by killing people, whether it is over there or whether it is here. In neither of those cases does that help anyone in Gaza or anyone who's Palestinian. And so, luckily, this is obviously not a representative of the movement. This is not a movement leader. This is not someone who was sent to do this by anybody. This is somebody who's unfortunately taken a legitimate political position about a geopolitical issue and infused it with a great degree of hatred that led him to commit this particular act. And that's who this is. It's is this act a hate crime? Well, I guess we're going to find out whether, I think it can be classified as a hate crime, sure, to the extent that this person only targeted these folks because he thought they were Jewish. If that's the case, that's what it becomes. Yeah. But what we do know is that this is someone who took an otherwise legitimate political position, that we have to have peace with justice in Palestine for all peoples, including those in Gaza. And we have to stop the slaughter that has been taking place in Gaza for all of this time and do something serious about that. And unfortunately, infuse that with the idea that the only way to do that is to spill the blood of two, supposed representatives of the government that you're angry with. It just makes absolutely zero sense. And luckily, unfortunately, I suspect that the vast majority of the Palestinian freedom movement is going to obviously distance, as it should, and condemn these actions.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. What do you think about this bill moving its way through? It just got passed out of the House. It's a giant piece of legislation.
It's so big and it's so beautiful.
That made it's one of those things where you just feel like so cringe that's a thing that, right. Every bill ever, some of them are hokey, but they always meant something. We can criticize all of them, but this is just,
I mean, the best part of it is, you expect Donald Trump to sell the legislation by calling it the big, beautiful bill, because his vocabulary is incredibly simplistic and he only speaks in those kind of terms. But the best part of this to me was listening to J.D. Vance use the term in the interview he did with Ross Douthat over at the New York Times a few days ago, where you listen to it and he's talking about the bill and he actually refers to it as the big, beautiful bill. And it's like you have to use that terminology. Yeah. If you don't use that terminology, then he's going to get in trouble, I guess, when he next sees the president. Why didn't you say big, beautiful bill? I'm sorry, Mr. President, I'll say it next time. I mean, it's just a level of sycophancy that you're just not used to, right? But I think what we see in the legislation is every sort of policy fever dream of the far right is jammed in there. It's a very long piece of legislation. It's very likely to get chopped up by the Senate. They don't tend to govern the same way as these yahoos over in the House. But what I do think, if you look deeply enough, it's not just the stuff that we know, like the ridiculous tax cuts for the affluent and the cuts in Medicaid and other services for people at the bottom, politically and economically. But there's something in there, and I saw something about it on Twitter yesterday, or on X or whatever the hell we're calling it. Apparently there is a clause in there in the tax section. And this, people may remember this, your listeners may remember this, it repeals the tax that was imposed back when Obama was president on tanning bed visits. You remember that?
Yes.
You remember back in the day, the big complaint, because again, this is why, Tim, why do you say everything is about race? Because everything is about race. Why are we repealing the tanning bed tax? Well, at the time, the far right's position that they articulated on talk radio every day when that tax was imposed by the president was, it's a tax on white people because only white people go to tanning beds. That's just the president's way of sticking it to us. Yeah, by trying to keep you from getting cancer, asshole. That awful, awful president who tried to protect you from skin cancer by making it more expensive for you to go do the thing that disproportionately causes it. But that was a huge complaint. You would hear it on the right all the time. So what does that lead me to believe now? The fact is, somebody said when they were compiling this bill, oh shit, you remember that tanning bed tax? Yeah, we got to take that out. Everything is about, they will work in race stuff, even to legislation that isn't about that. And then they're going to give each other high fives like, we can go to the tanning bed again and not have to pay the white people tax. I mean, it's astounding.
Oh, man. What do you think of the resistance, whether it be electeds or activists around the country? What do you make of what you're seeing as a reaction to what we are dealing with? We just won our local board seat. We won one of the seats. Very few people vote. It's, school board, and we didn't have this overt campaign this year against us demonizing a vulnerable population, which was nice. But our guy won. He's been there for 2 years, and he's real smart, and he won. And you're seeing a lot of progressives or Democrats win special elections in different places around the country. I was at the Mike Lawler rally, the one right before when my friend Emily Feiner got carried out. So you're seeing protests and town halls and legislation and special elections, but I don't know. I don't know what your feelings are on.
I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic. Look, I know everybody's like, where's the resistance? And some days I feel like that. There are days that I feel like, what's going on? But I know it seems like a decade has happened in 5 months or 4 months, right? I mean, and some months are like that, like 10 years can happen in a month. But the truth is, this is still relatively early on. And I do believe that we are going to see, I think if progressive folks run for office at the local level, talking school board, town council, whatever, city council, state government, various regulatory boards, whatever, and actually get out and meet people, I think that they would be surprised at how many elections that they could win. I think part of the problem for progressives, and I say this as someone here in Tennessee who, I think I mentioned to you when we were in Vegas, or I think I'm maybe getting the time frame wrong, but I think I mentioned I had gone to this event in Wilson County, which is 35 minutes out of Nashville, rural, semi-rural community, sort of a bedroom community for Nashville now. And back in the day, it was solidly Democratic. Now, I'm not going to say it was overly progressive, but it was solidly Democratic, and it would make common cause with those in the legislature who were progressive, and would always deliver the goods for people in the state to the greatest extent possible. It is now overwhelmingly Republican and very conservative. So I was brought out there because Michael Eric Dyson called me up. I was on a trip. And he calls me. He said, "I need you to pinch hit for me. I'm supposed to speak at the Wilson County Democratic Party barbecue they're having next week, but I'm double booked and I made a mistake and I need or something come up." And he's like, "I need a pinch hitter." And I said, "Man, I'll do it." But I didn't know if they knew who I was, and I didn't know if anybody would be there. Well, they did know who I was. They were excited to have me, and I got out there, and there were like 300 energized, multiracial Democrats and progressives from the Wilson County area who were talking about, hey, we're ready to go knock on doors. We're ready to start running for office. And they know that they're not going to win those seats right away. They're going to have to build up trust. They're going to have to generate some type of connection to the people they might not know yet. But if you keep coming every year and you knock on the door, or you go to the potluck, or you go to the bingo hall, or you go to the church, or you go to the whatever you go to, right? And you meet people, you start to build relationships. Then the next time there's an election, you may find yourself able to get those votes that you never thought you could get. So I do think there are signs that can happen. And I do think, I work with Kimberly Crenshaw and the folks at the African American Policy Forum, and we just had a big week of activation at the beginning of the month in Washington, D.C., principally, where we had an event that was not a march, because we didn't get a permit for a march. We weren't going to call it that. We just sort of walked over after a rally to protest the assault on the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We had several hundred people out in front of just around the corner. Really, we were in front of the mayor's office. I believe it's the mayor's office, or it was one of the official offices in DC, and a good 350 or 400 people out there. We had all these civil rights organizations represented. We had other events throughout the week. We did an event at Busboys and Poets, the bookstore in DC. We had, we had a bunch of media coverage for the week, and what you saw were people who were coming out to protest the assault on history because they understood that the real purpose of that assault is to undermine the rationale for the civil rights infrastructure that's been built over 70 years.
That makes it a lot easier to roll it back, which is exactly what it's so hard.
That's exactly right.
See how much, if you really read history, Heather Cox Richardson has done a great job focusing on the things that are getting rolled back vis-a-vis voting rights, civil rights, the mid 60s, all those gains and protections in the federal government, which is why a lot of Black and brown folks go to work in the federal government, because there's all these anti-discriminatory protections. So yeah, it makes it easier or more important now than ever to know what was achieved as they try to remove it, repeal it, roll it back.
Right. Well, I think there are two reasons they're going after it. One, and this is what I feel like the people who came to our rally and to our events understood, was that by taking away the recognition of just how much inequality and injustice there's been, you obviously take away the reason to have reparative programs, the reason to have DEI, the reason to do that. But what you also were doing, and this has not gotten nearly as much attention, I think part of it is that the administration, it's not just they don't want you to see the oppression part. That's the part they'll say. The oppression narrative is victim narrative, and it makes white people feel guilty and blah, blah, blah. I think the other part of this is that, like the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the irony of their attack on it is that is a story. The story that museum tells is a fundamentally American story of grit and determination and perseverance and overcoming obstacles. And that's when it struck me, it's not the oppression part that they don't want people to learn about. It's the overcoming part that they don't want people to learn about, right? It's the part where Black folks didn't quit and give up, right? Because if you can snatch that history away, then you don't show the roadmap. But all those folks that came to that event that AAPF helped to co-sponsor with the Freedom to Learn and Right to Learn Coalition and all of our civil rights partners, that those folks who were at that event, they understand very, very clearly what that history is. They understand how that history has inspired, and they're going to continue to teach it to their children and insist on its teaching in schools, regardless of what the administration does. And to see so many people come out and understand that the assault on history wasn't just an abstract academic thing, but it was really at the cornerstone of trying to just undermine the very logic of civil rights, the very logic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That was very heartening to me because, you know, you could easily see somebody saying, well, with the assaults on Social Security and Medicare and all these things, we don't have time to talk about fighting over a history museum. But people understood, and I think increasingly understand, there's a method to the madness of attacking a museum. Seems absurd until you start to realize what it is that they're trying to remove. And if it's the part about overcoming, if it's about a part about oppression and overcoming oppression, then you start to put two and two together and think, oh, they don't want to see the roadmap. They don't want to see that there is hope if you continue to struggle and if you continue to fight, right? Donald Trump wants people to be despondent, wants us all to think that his power is inevitable, that there's nothing that can stop him. And what that museum tells us, and I've said this many, many times since 2016, you know, that museum, look, Emmett Till's casket is there. There's an auction block there from which human bodies were sold. The axe handle that the former governor of Georgia used to chase black folks out of his restaurant during segregation, Lester Maddox, that's there. Photos and images of George Wallace and Bull Connor. And if those guys couldn't stop black people, I really am pretty confident that Donald John Trump is not the one. Right? He's not the one. And he doesn't want people to see that bigger and badder than him have tried and failed to eliminate the black freedom struggle or to defeat the black freedom struggle.
Oh, man. Very well said. I'm going to end it right there because that was such an important point, and I really appreciate it. Tim, as always, thank you. In the chat, our friend Tina says, appreciate you, Tim. Your work so much. You always keep us focused. You do. And it's really good to be in your classroom as always, my friend. Appreciate you joining us. I'll talk to you soon.
You bet. Good talking to you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for stopping by. That's it. That's all. I'll talk to you tonight at the Hangout if you're a subscriber. Bye-bye.